very much for coming, everybody, for braving the heat and for braving the noise and the misdirections to the first of our Meet the Transport Archivist seminars. So this evening we've got myself, Tamara Thornhill. I'm the Corporate Archives Manager for Transport for London, and we've got Faye McLeod here, who's the Archivist for Jaguar Heritage Trust. Between us, we're going to give you just sort of a little bit of an introduction to the collections in our respective repositories, and then we're also just going to look a bit more widely at what it is that an archivist actually does, and why you may, when you're sort of doing research, find gaps in collections, why you may find things sort of catalogued in a certain way, that type of thing. Anything that is going to help you understand a little bit more how you can get the best value from collections when you come to use them. So Faye's going to kick us off.
Okay, right. I will try and speak loudly enough to drown out the din. The Jaguar Heritage Trust looks after the historical records of what was Jaguar cars. We were set up in 1983. We were set up as a separate educational charity, and we were established as such to protect the historical assets of the company, i.e. if business did not go well, the vehicle collection, we have over 150 vehicles in the museum collection, and the archives could not be liquidated as assets. Our relationship with what is now Jaguar Land Rover is ongoing. They, under a deed of covenant agreement, provide funds to the trust each year. We also generate our own income. Due to historical separation between the companies, the trust looks after Jaguar records, but Land Rover records are held in the British Motor Industry Heritage Trust archives. We work under the Jaguar Land Rover Records Management Policy, and we are nominated as their place of final deposit for Jaguar-related records. There are 3 members of staff on the archive team, headed by myself. There's Karen Ram, photographic archivist, Mary O'Rourke, the administrative assistant, and I do have a set of 6 amazing volunteers who come in 4 days a week, but still we are spread thin. Answering queries from people such as yourselves, that would be me, Mary, or I would forward it if I thought one of the volunteers with subject-specific knowledge was better placed to handle it. It may be referred on. However, some inquiries are just too big for us to handle. It could be an awful lot of research, and as I said, the team is spread thin, so in which case we would invite you to come on site and conduct your own research. What do we hold? We are a marque-specific archive. We look after Jaguar, its predecessor, Swallow Sidecars, SS, Daimler and Lanchester. We do, with our collection policy, try to avoid competition with other motoring archives, and within that we still manage to have a myriad of holdings. Unusually, for my sins, we also look after the artefact collections. So the joke in the trust is anything smaller than a car is Faye's problem. So yes, I also look after our suspension rigs, engine demonstration rigs, brake tests, and so forth. I've put up the main divisions within our collections, the overarching groupings that they can be separated up into. And just to comment on a couple of them, the majority is self-explanatory. When I say company records, that's day-to-day running, financials, meeting minutes, and so forth. Personal papers are the office papers of significant individuals within the company. So we hold the Sir William Lyons collection, who founded the company. We hold the Lofty England collection, who was competition manager and took over as managing director when Lyons retired. Vehicle records, by which I mean production records, statistics, build analysis, and our most popular collection, technical publications, which tends to be things like handbooks, service manuals, parts lists, and so forth. So, what do we decide to keep and how do we make those decisions? Well, overall, as I said earlier, we are guided by the Jaguar Land Rover records management policy, and I helped the company with a rewrite of their policy over the past 2 years, which was great. We got to have input into explaining to the company, areas of importance, and so there are within the retention schedule classes of records marked for mandatory transfer to the archives and classes of records marked for suggested transfer to the archives. So prior to that and feeding into that, really, I don't really want to get into too much theory, but there's two competing theories which were put forward by two big archival theorists. Jenkinson argued that what material is preserved for permanent preservation should be determined by the originating company, i.e. Jaguar should tell me what they wish to keep. And certainly that works for what they know they legally must retain and what they wish to retain for future usage. However, I think there's also merit in Schellenberg's approach, another theorist, who argued that the archivist must select based upon the needs of current and future researchers. I've always found myself getting quite nervous with that, trying to predict research trends and use in the future. But what we can do is look at what records are requested now, what sort of material do we find answers a range of queries, and we can use that to filter into our overarching collecting policy. So, if you have people like me sitting there thinking about what to keep, why are there gaps? Unfortunately, lost to history is a fairly common answer. The archive itself, 1983, is very young in comparison to the three companies with Lanchester originating in the late 1800s. So you've got a company that maybe at the time didn't think that records were particularly important. For example, although we hold the build ledgers, which hold the very important build information for each Jaguar produced, so chassis number, engine number, body number, gearbox number, colour, and so forth. What weren't preserved were the build sheets that went down the tracks with the vehicles, and those included information like optional extras, and that includes things like, did it have air conditioning? Did it have a sunroof? And I keep praying that these sheets will have miraculously been preserved on a piece of microfiche that I haven't found yet. But it hasn't happened so far. Also, sometimes companies have weird policies, and they can decide that the past isn't very important and they should have a clean slate and look to the future. And certainly that was the case during the British Leyland period. It was just a bank of skips outside the factory. And offices, historical records, when British Leyland took over Jaguar, they just filled the skips. And it's heartbreaking, and I salute the skip divers amongst the workforce at that time, because it's now coming in dribs and drabs as people sort out their attics. But there we are. Occasionally it's not passed to us by the company through error or oversight. Not everyone follows the RMP religiously. I do chase people. I'm very persistent. I have a nagging list wherein I contact employees and remind them. It's not always successful, but we do our best. There's also issues such as space. I have a finite amount of space in which to store information. And there's also company procedure. It may be that they decide that they want to dispose of items, and that is their decision. We are, after all, looking after these records on their behalf. There's also problems of identification. Unfortunately, for instance, old photographs, the people who would be able to identify the individuals within that photograph, or what is happening, or where it was, are no longer around, so I always welcome input from researchers. How do we catalogue? I can only speak specifically from my own experience here. I was the first professional qualified archivist in post. My predecessor was an excellent historian who wrote very good books, but he wasn't really into listing things. And so there are a group of volunteers who acted to the best of their knowledge. But whilst I admire a great deal of what they did, there were some questionable decisions, such as the dispersal of the collection of a well-known motoring historian amongst other materials. And whilst we can try and bring that collection back together, we can't guarantee it. So one of the first things I did on arrival, knowing that we were facing the move from Browns Lane to Gaydon, was to construct what got called the inventory database. And it's a very rough file-level description of the contents of the archives. And as I said, it was initially designed to control the move, so I could check where something started, where it was in transit, and where it ended up. It is confidential. I can't share it with the public. It contains everything, including references to confidential records and locations. And because it was only ever intended as a stopgap measure, and still is, it can be rather temperamental when it comes to searching. And with the myriad number of ways you can find to write Mark II, MKII, Mark in full, number 2, you have to know to search for each of those. So we are working towards cataloguing to ISO-G, the international standard, and the catalogues are uploaded to our website when these are complete. When there are more catalogues extant, we will move to AdLib online, so it will be even more searchable and easier to use. Cataloguing is prioritised according to request, and it's reviewed every year. What are people asking for? Where should I be pushing time and resources? So it's very much guided by researchers. My archive is unusual in that we do allow access to uncatalogued collections. That was because after the move and the dust had settled, I realised that if we closed all uncatalogued collections, it would be a very long time before a lot of the collections became accessible. Therefore, what we recommend people do, if the catalogue that you wish is not online, contact me. I will run a search through the inventory database and provide you with a list of suitable non-confidential documents for you to select from. We cannot produce a catalogue that would search each researcher completely. If we organised by year, what would happen to the people who were looking at specific models? If we organised by specific models, how would people who were writing about famous individuals within the company fare? And therefore, we catalogue by originating department, experimental, marketing, PR, and so forth, and we catalogue to original order where possible. This is because of the extra information that can be found from context. A great example of that is the Lyons collection again. It's in the order that it was extracted from his office, and from that we can tell what he thought was important. If he's put a letter in correspondence 1960 to 65, it's unlikely he was thinking he was going to have to find that, individual document again. If it's in correspondence with Studebaker, it's likely that there was a particular relationship with that entity. He viewed it as higher importance. So, within cataloguing, there are occasions where I cannot permit access to materials, and this is because of the relationship between the company and the trust. Working under the Jaguar Land Rover records management policy, there are classes of material and documents that have various security ratings. And the one that crops up most with archive material is the classification proprietary. Under proprietary ratings, I am only allowed to grant access to JLR employees with a business need to know. An example of this is our engineering drawings. This applies to models that are no longer in production, and it is to protect the intellectual property of the company. The company manufactures classic spare parts. And it is also to protect the company, to protect the trust and the archive from legal liability. We've been advised that if a part is manufactured from a drawing that we supply and that part fails, causing harm to a person, that the archive will at least be held partially liable. Therefore, we don't release engineering drawings. However, there are classes of documents where there's a limited amount of sensitivity, and for that we use agreed closure periods. Recently, a project between the Archive, JLR Records Management Coordinator and head of the Global IP Council, who advise Jaguar on intellectual property, we conducted a review of every single collection, and we recommended closure periods against each collection, and these were reviewed and agreed. And basically that gives consistency. It gives consistency behind the decisions we make and the reasoning behind them, and it means that every person who comes to us gets the same answer as well. It ensures fairness as opposed to making ad hoc decisions. There are also legal restrictions. Data Protection Act, the company is cautious about transferring DPA-covered records now. However, it's an issue with older collections, such as apprentice records, and the DPA requires that we assume a data subject age of 18 at point of creation and a lifespan of 100 years. So you can imagine, yes, they're still closed. Copyright, there's unfortunately a history of gentlemen's agreements. Very, very, very tiresome. Researchers aren't the only people to be frustrated by lack of documentation. And it can be a costly mistake to make. If an archive releases an image or allows an image to be used and it is proved not to be our copyright, it can be a very costly mistake. And so we may wish not to allow access to images before we're able to do copyright clearance work, and we may not be able to permit photographs in the reading room of certain collections. There's also conservation concerns. The very large build ledgers that contain the person build information for vehicles are held in these extraordinarily large ledgers, and they've seen a fair bit of wear and tear over the years. Occasionally something is so damaged and in the waiting list to go to the paper conservator, I would judge it too fragile to be handled, and in which case I would take your details and let you know when it is in a suitable state for handling. There's also practical and moral concerns behind allowing access. To use the build ledgers as examples again, we've had to put stronger restrictions in place because matching number vehicles are worth more than cars that have had engines swapped or gearboxes swapped or bodies swapped or are what we delightfully refer to as bitsers, which are where all four components come from completely different cars. And unfortunately, there are some unscrupulous people who would come and would look up what the number should be and restamp. And when a build ledger has 20 cars to a page, that's an awful lot of valuable information. And we want to protect enthusiasts, and we want to make sure that people are buying what they think they're buying. And therefore, restrictions were put in place that only allow notation for statistical reasons. Information is released to appropriate individuals through our heritage certificate service, but there are procedures in place there wherein we ask for the original information so we can confirm it, or we ask for a copy of the V5C so that we can check that the vehicle is kosher and in existence. There was also some unfortunate business of people looking for cars with famous first owners. That makes them more valuable as well, and restamping vehicles with a different chassis number. And so, yeah, we put in stronger restrictions and asked researchers to sign an NDA. So if you would like to come and see us, and we're very friendly and we have a really nice cafe that does fantastic bacon butties, we would ask, please submit your query via email first. It might not be as weird a question as you think it is, and we do keep answers on file. Please be patient. We're a small team, and we will be working on the fullest answer to you, or I might be waiting for the most appropriate researcher. For instance, Den, who's fantastic with our XJ40 range, is in on Wednesdays, so I might be waiting until then to talk to him. If you'd like to come and conduct personal research, we share a reading room at the British Motor Museum. Because it's a shared small space, we do ask for 7 days' notice of intended visits. For your first visit, we'd require photographic ID, and we do charge a £5 administration fee for photography permits, which is only payable when the collection is, we do agree that it can be photographed. And should you wish to talk to me, there's my contact details.
Thank you very much, Faye. So it's really interesting hearing you speak, and sort of obviously, unsurprisingly, I guess, as a fellow archivist, a lot of the issues you were talking about, they're also very common across a lot of different collections and repositories, and we certainly experience them at Transport for London. Again, being sort of a company that has a lot of emphasis on its branding, its identity, we have lots of our access restrictions are actually around protecting that side of things, that the roundel being sort of apparently the second most recognised corporate symbol in the world, after McDonald's. Slightly disappointing, but probably not surprising. And then it's also sort of, you know, the whole idea of that the conflict between what the company wants you to keep and what you as an archivist feel should be kept, what researchers want you to keep. So finding the balance is always quite tricky. So, TfL Archives. Just to start off, just to give you a tiny bit of context, Transport for London's corporate archives does not just relate to Transport for London. Transport for London obviously has only been in existence since 2000, but our collections date right the way back to the 17th century. The reason for that is twofold. The first one being that whilst TfL was formed in 2000, it's actually only the latest incarnation of an overarching authority. And even prior to 1933, in the first sort of public authority responsible for transport in London, you know, the original railway companies all still existed. So we have inherited all of their records, or the ones that survive. And then the second reason that it goes back so far is you just get a lot of inherited stuff that comes in collections. So that's sort of a tiny bit of just broadening it out, really. We have 3 members of staff. So there's myself as the corporate archives manager, there's an assistant archivist who's responsible for inquiries and researchers, and outreach, which is a nice umbrella term for me to basically give her anything that I want to. And we have a cataloguing archivist. The company did not appoint an archivist until 1991. And that archivist was effectively confronted with probably about 5 rooms the size of this one, floor to ceiling, with no discernible arrangement or order to it. So that means that there was an awful lot of time spent just working out what was there. And so it wasn't really until 2000 that the Archives as a service was in a position to actually start properly cataloguing and start thinking about providing proper access to the collections. What this has led to is a state of confusion and also a sort of separating to a little extent of what should be the corporate archives collections. What that means is we are not the London Transport Museum. The Archives is very much a department within Transport for London. We are answerable to the board. We are just sort of, or I am just sort of full removed from the commissioner. If you look through the hierarchical structure, the museum. TfL is a very odd beast in terms of its setup, but the most simplistic description is it sort of sits off to the side a little bit. It reports into the board, but isn't necessarily answerable to the board. It gets a small amount of money from TfL, but that amount of money is decreasing all the time. They are a registered charity. We are not. All of our funding comes centrally. They tell a story. They are there to tell a story of transport in London as provided by anybody. We don't tell a story. That's up to our researchers to do. They come and use the collections to work that story out for themselves. They deal with objects. We generally say no thank you, we don't want any trains and that type of thing. However, because we did not have an archivist until 1991, the Transport Museum is now responsible for parts of the collection that you would perhaps normally expect to find more within the corporate archives. So they, for example, have all of the poster collection. They have quite a large percentage of the physical map collection. They will have some engineering drawings, and it is that, it's what Faye was talking about, it's just that legacy issue. And we still suffer a little bit to that today, people not quite knowing where to put stuff and who to offer it to. Thankfully, we now have a very good relationship with the Transport Museum, and I sit on sort of their collections development group, so we've always got that oversight of what's being offered. They're also doing a good piece of work around rationalising their collections, and sort of some material is beginning to be rehomed with us and vice versa a little bit. So we're starting to sort that out. In terms of the collections that we do have in the corporate archives, there's over 155,000 hard copy files and over 181,000 digital files, which actually is really quite a scary figure when you put it into the context of how long we've been collecting for. Because obviously those 155,000 physical files we've either been proactively keeping, or they've just been put in that one of those rooms and where everything got dumped for over 150 years. Digital files we've only been collecting for 5 years, and yet we've already got 181,000 of them. So that's really quite frightening, and something I like to not think about too much, because otherwise I may end up quivering in a corner somewhere. As I said, they date from the 17th century right the way through till tomorrow. We are concerned with collecting material that is evidencing decisions. It's all about, what decisions has the organisation made? Why have they made them? How did they go about putting them into practice? Why did they do them in a certain way? What did they discount? What this means is that we end up collecting not just transport history, we end up with material that's about social history, it's about economic history, it's any impact really that the organisation and its predecessors have had on London, either in terms of its economy, its makeup, or its urban realm, its built environment, and the people that are living within it. We will also collect some personal stories, but only if we feel they're filling in a gap in the collections that perhaps the documents that we have, we're never going to get those documents to fill that gap. So we will then collect personal stories. Basically, everything that we're looking to collect is evidencing that tagline of ours, which is "Every journey matters." Does this document prove that every journey matters? Does it prove that it's the right journey? It's not just a journey that the company's decided somebody wants to take, it's one that they do actually want to make. So the collections, at their core, they are a business archive, so they're quite annual report and accountsy heavy. There's also lots of stuff there, capital projects, patents and designs, so that's all coming back to the rounder. You would not believe how many patents are registered against the roundel for various uses of it. The font that goes through the middle is trademarked, the map is trademarked. There is so much design work involved in TFL, it's really unbelievable. We have some fantastic records around sort of various staff clubs and staff events that, again, whilst, yes, their focus is our organisation and our employees, what they're actually doing is shedding just an enormous light on attitudes of the time and what was going on in a wider context at the time. So the collections, it's really interesting when you look at our user statistics and who is using us. Predominantly now it is the business, but when you look at members of the public who are using us, most of them aren't coming to us to do what you would say is simply transport history. They're doing that art and architecture. They're trying to find out the history of a building. They're trying to find out about an artist who perhaps we commissioned to design a poster for us. They're trying to find out. We had one who was looking into the history of a theatre on Oxford Street, and they couldn't find many pictures of this theatre. And they came to us and they said, "Have you got pictures of buses going up and down Oxford Street?" "Yes, of course we have." "Lovely, there's my theatre in the background." Something that we just never have thought that's what it would be used for. What that material ends up looking like is a whole mishmash. You've got maps, you have historical timelines, we've got a finance records, there's one of the patents slipping in there, information about sort of abandoned railways and buildings, there's line diagrams, electric working, train design, all sorts of things going on in there. Quite a lot about suicide. Just actually, it's really interesting sort of how the organisation deals with that. Both in terms of actually trying to prevent it and then through to dealing with an incident when it happens, and all of the aftercare that goes on around it as well for sort of drivers. And the organisation also does quite a lot to support the suicide victims' families afterwards, if it's deemed necessary. That's one of our old generating stations. More and more maps. But coming back to what Faye was saying, we're not going to collect something just because it's pretty. We're not going to collect something just because it's old. It has to have informational value. So just sort of the ones that I've picked up there, just as an example, some of them look reasonably innocuous. You'd think that we are keeping them just because they're pretty, but not necessarily so. So this photograph in the bottom corner, nice picture of a plane and a bus. What that is actually from is a particular collection, and it is the collection relating to the London aircraft production factories during the Second World War, because some of our bus works were given over to providing and manufacturing parts for planes. So we actually built planes during the Second World War. something like the letter in the top corner, again, that could very easily just be filed away as some correspondence. What that correspondence is about is a planned terror attack in the Thames Tunnel at the end of the 19th century. Finance record there, but that's actually a very detailed and easy to follow as well, which is quite key, outlining of exactly how the Inner Circle Railway was funded, how they sold these shares, what they advertised these shares as being to the shareholders. So it is very much that emphasis on evidential value. It's what is the type of information that is contained within this document. So anyone is welcome to use us. That's just an idea up there of kind of the amount of inquiries and visits we get per year. As I said, we have got to the point now where over 50% of our inquiries are coming from internal staff, which is excellent because that helps me fight my corner for money, etc., etc. And the more use I can be to the business, the better. But members of the public are more than welcome to make inquiries. We do have restrictions on access, and those restrictions will be around data protection, they will be around commercial confidentiality, and they will be around health and safety and security. So commercial confidentiality, very much what sort of Faye was talking about, that's about protecting our design rights and our ideas and also those of people that we enter into partnership with. That material we tend to close for 20 years. Data protection, again, that's about protecting the personal information of living individuals. That material we close for 84 years. And health and safety and security reasons, we will close for 100 years. But actually, it's very likely that some of that material could be closed for up to 200, 300 years. I'm thinking of things like very, very detailed diagrams of tunnels running under Parliament Square and that type of thing. We really have to think about that type of stuff. Station plans, we get so many requests to look at station plans, and on the face of it, they're absolutely fine. But every now and then, they'll tell you exactly how you can get right through to the back of the building, and that's not the type of thing that we want to put out there. We will employ redacting at times, so you can see all of the other information that's on the plan. But even then, we have to be careful, because if we just redact one tiny area, it kind of becomes a bit obvious what we're trying to cover up. But all of those types of decisions we're answerable to the Information Commissioner on, so anybody can challenge us on those decisions. So we have to be quite certain that we're getting it right. Just a few examples of some recent inquiries. There's a mixture up there of internal and external inquiries. The top one, Marble Arch, Edgware Road from Road Space Management, they are refurbishing the subways coming out of Marble Arch Underground Station, and basically up for grabs on the various sections of tiling. So various business areas have said, oh yeah, we'll take 2 sections, we'll take 3 sections. Road Space Management have decided they'll take 3 sections and then realised they don't know what to put on these sections. So they've come to the archive to see if we've got any original pictures, plans, and anything visual and interesting about the history of the junctions around that area. So we've come up with a couple of bits and pieces for them. 1906 tube stock, that's actually an inquirer from Hungary who's trying to compare the Hungarian tube stock with the 1906 tube stock from the underground. Ethnic minorities in transport, station upgrades. Station upgrades use us quite a lot of the time now. They're trying to sort of get an idea of, they start stripping away something off of a wall, what might they find behind it, that type of thing. air quality on the tube for government relations. So it's a whole mix of material. And then there are us three archivists looking after all this material. That's not actually what we look like in our rooms. This is one of my favourite pictures ever of an archivist. This is Herbert Wells Faye, who was the archivist, tour guide and ambassador for the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. And if anybody's ever been to the Lincoln Memorial, there's like a tiny little door off at the side of it, and if you went through that, you'd find this guy sitting there in his room full of documents, just gradually sorting through them, writing nice little histories and things. Unfortunately, that's not what we do, mainly because we don't have time, and the reason we don't have time is because this is what we actually do. Now, I've sort of separated it out between the three of us. It's fair to say that everything that the cataloguing archivist does, the other two of us will do to some extent, the same for the assistant archivist, and then some of my tasks they'll sort of obviously contribute towards too and help out on. But the cataloguing archivist, she is there literally to focus on cataloguing, and that is both physical and digital cataloguing. We have a backlog of just over 3,000 boxes for physical cataloguing, which is actually very good for an organisation of our size. So her job really is to make sure that it doesn't end up getting higher and higher, because we are still actively collecting paper records at a rate of approximately 700 or 800 boxes a year. So you can see there she's operating on quite a tight schedule. She will also do a lot of catalogue rationalisation. Similar to Faye's situation, where certain decisions have been made in the past that perhaps don't stand up now, and more importantly don't help the user to actually use the collections. Zoe is going through and she's finding out, how can we pull these collections back together and make things much more user-friendly. Our assistant archivist inquiries, research visits, missing records. We do have, there's probably about 1,000 records that are in the system that are currently listed as missing. Now, that could literally just be human error, that they've got put back in the wrong box. In some cases, it's turning out that they never even came to us in the first place. They were catalogued on the understanding that they would come to us, and they never arrived. So we're doing quite a bit of work to try and get that number down and actually work out what that all means. And just to pick out a few from myself, the intellectual review is quite an interesting one. That feeds into the cataloguing. So those sort of 700-800 boxes that we're bringing into the archives each year, they are actually the result of a review programme that runs in our records store. Our records store is for our current and semi-current records. Everything that gets put in there with a retention period around them, so say 7 years for most financial records, for example, so how long you have to keep them for legislative reasons. You're not going to need them for any business reason after that. So when every single box in that record store reaches the end of its retention period, I do an intellectual review of it. So I end up intellectually reviewing approximately 35,000 boxes a year to determine whether or not they are likely to contain material that should come into the archives collections. We'll also do catalogue enhancements, and again, that's designed to just make everyone's life easier in terms of using the collections. Sometimes people haven't necessarily described things in the catalogue as helpfully as they could do, so we'll sort of flesh those out a bit. We'll flag things up if we think they're particularly pretty or press-worthy and that type of thing. And then the other sort of big thing, obviously, is working on the digital strategy, as well as all the budgeting and forecasting and education work, etc., etc., etc. And that, in a nutshell, is why archivists don't have time to be historians. I think it's probably fair to say, is it, Faye?
Yeah, I would sincerely love the time to go through in more detail, but I think the archivist role has expanded so much over the past few decades that we didn't get to do that.
We can't. It sort of sounds strange, but we can't actually be the experts on our collections, on the content of our collections. We can be experts on the structure of the collections and perhaps why things have been arranged in a certain way, why you might not be able to find certain information. But in terms of the absolute content, that $1 million question, do you have this? A lot of the time we're not actually going to know the answer. You have to come and put the legwork in. But you're very welcome to put the legwork in, and that's how you can do it.